Good evening, this is Goldie, also known as Mr. Anecdotal, Mr. Pasty and the Talking Head. It's Wednesday, August 3rd, 2011. Remember, most importantly, I rant so you don't have to. If I don't have your email and you'd like to receive the script of each show, send your email to my new email address, which is goldierant@gmail.com. I'm going to try and do this now, but apparently a freaking idiot named Obama is using Ustream for his drunken birthday broadcast, so I may end up doing this tomorrow, and I apologize. That's just how it goes. Also, sorry for being inconsistent on the days that I do this show. Various family tragedies have gotten in the way. I'm in the New York area right now, but I am still thinking. Also, a friend of mine in Argentina said she was bored and wanted to be entertained. Well, Wendy, this is not going to be entertaining. It's a tutorial, and it's painful and difficult. Sorry. Here's a brief summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about the partisan politics of Glenn Beck and his ilk. I'm going to talk about water, as I wrote a letter to the editor of the Austin American-Statesman following their fluff piece, Saturday, July 24th, 2011. And my letter to the editor was published. I'm going to talk about new urbanism and how gas prices not reflecting the true cost are slowing the migration from the suburbs into dense downtowns. So I was driving in New York through America's heartland, listening to old country on the AM radio, and I ran across Glenn Beck doing his radio show. He was talking about two things. The first was Cynthia McKinney, who I guess used to be a congresswoman. She was in the Middle East and was at a peace conference in Iran and had been at one in Libya. She was being interviewed by an Iranian correspondent. She started talking about how the last great chance for peace was in the 60s. However, quotes, they assassinated JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and Malcolm X. The correspondent asked, of course, who they were, and she replied, the authorities. Now Glenn, as any good liar will do, focused on that statement and how it was insane, etc. And he stated that this was an example of someone who is committing treason and is a traitor to the U.S. Why is she, quotes, with our enemies with whom we are at war, close quotes, he asked. Well, I guess I became a little agitated. No, I became very agitated. We have not declared war on anyone since World War II. The War Powers Act was an unconstitutional relinquishment of Congress's sole right to declare war. And even if the War Powers Act is constitutional, it has never been followed to the letter, even in Libya. Additionally, she was attending a peace conference. Is the act of attending a peace conference treasonous? Is the act of questioning the motives or actions of the United States government treasonous? Well, I'm committing treason. When I told my Tea Party friend about it, he was equally agitated. Well, not equally, but agitated. Glenn, the act of not questioning your United States government is, to me, treasonous. Now, Glenn did not want to go too far because he would be supporting Obama, which he can never, ever do. He's a Republican. A little later, Glenn was talking about the second thing that got my blood going, and that was regarding legislation in Washington and how it was written by special interests. I re-perked up and actually got excited that he might get to the heart of the problem. He started talking about the stimulus and how it was written by the Apollo Group, some nefarious, underhanded, conspiratorial cabal that runs Obama and controls the Obama socialist agenda. He stopped right there. And as usual, he effed his viewers and listeners. I had hoped he would take the extra step and go into the structural regulatory defect of corporations and other groups, including unions, being deemed people by the pro-corporate Supreme Court appointed by George W. Bush and his father, entitled to free speech rights in the form of unlimited campaign contributions in kind under the Citizens United case and other McCain-Feingold limiting cases. But no, Glenn did not go into that structural defect. He just railed on Obama, implying that anyone else would be a better president and would not be controlled by his or her own cabal of industrialists or communists. Glenn, I will bet that if you started reading my rants and going that little itsy-bitsy step, you'd still be on Fox. Well, maybe not on Fox, but definitely still on TV. Now let me move on to my main subject, water. Turns out that water and the drought in Texas will allow me to cover most of the defects that exist in the system. The editors on July 24, 2011 wrote a fluff piece about the drought. The main point of the editorial, if there was one, was that the old-timers would not admit that this drought is as bad as the drought in the 50s. As usual, the editors missed the main point of any discussions regarding water. My letter to the editor was published July 28, 2011, and it read as follows. Editor, your July 23, 2011 editorial, "The time it never rained has come again," on the drought misses the mark entirely. The main point of the current drought crisis is that this is the perfect time, before it rains again, for our legislature to pass a law making the requirement of any water use for landscaping contained in any recorded restrictive covenant, commercial or residential, void as a matter of law. This would free individual landowners from these water-wasting burdens and would save an enormous amount of water for showering and flushing toilets. They printed it. I received a text from a friend who read the letter to the editor. Quotes, "For the sake of argument and regarding your rant in the paper, water requirement deed restrictions, is this not just a way of adding just another thing to the state's ability to control our daily life under your term, the commons?" And there were 2 exclamation points. Pretty slippery slope, question mark. Let me read it again, because it doesn't really make that much sense. I appreciate, buddy, seriously, you sending it to me, but for the sake of argument and regarding your rant in the paper, is this not just a way of adding just another thing to the state's ability to control our daily life under your term, the commons? Pretty slippery slope. It's what we call mixed metaphors, mixed messages, and mixed statements. As you might expect, a response like this absolutely woke me up from my stupor of that morning. I replied to my friend, quote, "Almost all issues regarding regulation, commons, subsidized energy, incremental cost of the next gallon of water, subsidized development, energy used to transport water, subsidies to energy companies, Schlitterbahn on 1431, cheap water for lawns, subsidized tap fees, etc." So again, all of those issues are handled in this discussion. Now, in all fairness to my friend, he was watching the news, which currently was only filled with what I like to call Casey Anthony goes to Washington, or the debt ceiling non-crisis. We've emailed back and forth about the inability of legislators to do the right thing or stop spending other people's money. My friend believes that if we send a bunch of new good legislators to Washington, they will be able to stop the spending. I disagree and believe that we need to change the rules so that any legislator, good or bad, sent to Washington will stop spending. Let me give you a sports metaphor. Visualize the time in sports when steroids were legal. You're a home run hitter. You're on the team with other home run hitters who are taking steroids. You're playing against other teams that have home run hitters that are taking steroids. Your livelihood is dependent on you hitting home runs in your contract, and your team is dependent on you hitting home runs in order to win. You don't want to take steroids because you saw that player from the Oakland Raiders, I can't remember his name, get brain cancer from steroids, and you don't want to die that way or that early. But because of the rules, steroids being legal, you either take the steroids or your team loses because you don't hit as many home runs as the steroid users. You get fired because you don't hit as many home runs, and your family starves. It's exactly the same thing with the legislators regarding spending. They would all like to do the right thing, but because of the rules that are set up, they have to take campaign contributions from donors and corporations and other groups, or they won't get reelected. They have to always be running for office because there are no term limits. And yes, I am ignoring the de minimis number of legislators that are specifically one-termers, because there is effectively none of this type of political animal called the citizen politician. They are following the rules that are set up for them by us. I know all of that was long-winded, but I wanted to give you the background on my friend. He's extremely intelligent, but he subscribes to the John Locke point of view that man is basically good. I subscribe to the Thomas Hobbes point of view that man is basically evil and requires rules to play nicely with his playmates. I certainly believe my view was buttressed during the BP oil gusher debacle and the ensuing theories that I developed out of that thing. Many people argued that BP was bad. I argued that they were neither good nor bad, but that they were doing exactly what we wanted all individuals and entities to do under our system of the free market. And that is, we want them all to maximize. It's up to us to write the rules that contain all of this maximization. It is not up to these individuals and entities to self-regulate, because if they want to survive vis-a-vis their neighbor, they cannot afford to self-regulate. You see it in the case of steroid users in baseball when it was legal. You see it in the case of our legislators. You see it in the case of individuals, and you see it in the case of industry and its entities. So we've gotten to a clear look at the incentives and disincentives that plague our political system. And these incentives and disincentives drive almost all behavior. It seems a pretty simple concept to me. Now we need to go back to the concept of a commons and the incentives and disincentives that drive behavior regarding the commons. Garrett Hardin wrote and dissected the concept of the commons and tragedy of the commons and living within limits. He's a writer who believes that we have limited resources on the planet. And of these limited resources, we have air, land, and water. Those are commons. In our United States system of private property, a large chunk of actual land is not owned by private individuals, but is owned by all of us through our government, hence a commons. Similarly, air is owned by no one, but by all of us, as is water, subject to differing state laws. The tragedy of the commons is a concept whereby, in the absence of any regulation, the commons becomes decimated through the maximization by individuals and entities. Let's use the Garrett Hardin example. A large piece of property is owned by a town that has its largest enterprise, ranchers of cattle. All ranchers have the right to graze their cattle on the town commons. There's no rules. But none are responsible specifically for ensuring that the commons does not become overgrazed or erodes. There's no taxes, there's no fees. If a rancher self-regulates by not running his cattle all the time, his neighbor's cattle will grow larger and fatter, and his cattle will be smaller and thinner, and the rancher's family will starve. So the only way to keep the town commons from being decimated would be for the government to impose regulations on the number of cattle that you are allowed to graze on the commons, the time period that you are allowed to graze, and potentially and the monetary contribution that you will have to make to be a user of the commons. Think about entrance fees to national forests, or grazing or leasing fees for cattle grazers in national forests, or leasing fees to oil companies to drill in national forests. You are being charged to be a user of the commons. It keeps the costs for the use of these commons not commonized. In other words, all of the owners, which are us, the taxpayers, do not pay for the upkeep of those national forests. That would be if all of those people that were getting leases or were doing mining or were using it were paying the actual cost of their use. However, the question of what is the actual cost of such use is open to substantial interpretation and, of course, abuse by those with power. But the theory is that we would want the individuals who use it to pay the cost, to not be allowed to commonize the cost to all of the taxpayers. As I said, we would like to see the actual cost of the user if any commons paid for by the user, which would lead to the actual cost-benefit analyses done by the people and entities who are profiting from the use of the commons. So think about it. If we really charged what it actually cost for a mining company to come into a national forest, and I mean all of the cost of the trees being knocked down and it taking years and years to bring them back up to speed, the cost of all of the sludge being drained into the creeks. That was all put in there, and then those companies knew what that cost was, and they were charged that cost. They could do a cost-benefit analysis and determine whether or not it was worth mining for that coal in that national forest. Versus now, they're paying a small pittance of the actual cost, and that happens throughout all of our commons in this country. Garrett Hardin recoined a term that he used for the general behavior of an individual or entity, corporation or union, that uses the commons in trying to maximize. Again, maximization is what we want all individuals and entities to do in the free market system. And that term is the commonized cost, privatized profits game. In this CCPP game, the individual or entity attempts to privatize, which means only inure to the benefit of the profits and only to the shareholders of the corporation, and commonize the costs, which means push as many of the costs off to the other people, us, the taxpayers. So an example would be mountaintop coal removal in the national forest. The mountaintop is blown off and all of the excrement rolls down the hill into the creeks and rivers, for which those companies have no responsibility under the existing regulations. The responsibility falls to us, the taxpayers. The responsibility to clean it up if we want. The profits from the coal mining inure only to the benefit of the shareholders of the coal company and the executives of the company, salaries, which is the meaning of the term privatized profits. Back to water specifically. In Texas, we have a legal concept called prior appropriation, which means that the first user of water, that the first user of water has the right to continue taking that amount of water even in times of drought. This is just from the rivers. That means if there is not enough water for all, the first user gets to use his entire allotment, and only then is the second user allowed to start his allotment. If you define drought as a period of time when there is not enough water for all users that desire to use it, this drought has been going on since the 1970s. However, if you prefer to only define drought as periods of extreme heat, evaporation, and no rain, extreme, 100 degrees, we have been in one in 2011. So we have a period of time where there is a scarce commons, water, that is allocated by state law and regulation. In Texas, we have many users of water, homes and businesses that use water for drinking, showering, and toilets. Agricultural users like the rice farmers downstream on the Colorado River. Ranching users who use water to irrigate fields for cattle and use water for the washing away of fecal wastes, ironically back into the river from where they get their own drinking water. Industrial users that use water in the manufacturing of hard drives and microprocessors like AMD and Motorola. Energy-producing users such as coal and nuclear plants that use water for cooling and processing. And finally, homes, businesses, and municipalities that use water for landscaping and lawns. Please note that the City of Austin estimates that 60% of all water usage in the City of Austin goes for the landscaping line item. 60%. Lawns. Okay, so we have our global concept of the commons of water, and we have the specific regulatory system in Texas. The City of Austin has purchased water rights from the Lower Colorado River Authority, supposedly to handle their needs for the next 50 years or so. The city recently approved a $500 million water treatment plant, and for all of us within that jurisdiction, our rates will go up to pay for that water plant. Very simple math would dictate that if there were an outright ban on outside watering, this $500 million expenditure could be put off for 20 years or so. This is what I like to refer as the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the incremental cost of the last hookup of water. When we talk about the tap fees that the City of Austin imposes upon developers, the fact that we may be nearing capacity when the developer hooks up does not increase the cost to the developer. So, we have a tap fee of, and I'll get to it a little bit later, $5,000. Well, it's $5,000 for anybody anywhere, even though we may be extending lines out there, because we say growth is good. So more homes is good. Yet this growth is good technique forces all of us to subsidize the actual cost of connecting that new home up to the water grid. Without that last home, we would not need to spend the $500 million. Shouldn't a developer that tips the balance towards the requirement of spending $500 million pay the $500 million? I'm not sure. It's just a question. But it feels like that developer should not only be paying the lowly water tap fee of $5,000 per hookup and then sapping us with the $500 million because he pushed us over the limit of our existing water treatment capacity. Separately, without the use of water for landscaping, we would not have to spend the $500 million. If we look at the City of Austin's water supplies, we would all agree that water is a scarce resource, a scarce commons, to be regulated by the city. So I'm using the city as the microcosm of the regulatory authority. Without regulation, the water would spill in the streets, and I mean literally. People would be watering their streets, which they do. They water their driveways in Texas. And we would be unable to flush our toilets. Now, my friend did not specifically address the fact that the city already regulates water use, sets rates to adjust behavior, and has a mandatory rationing program going on right now. He did not address the fact that these measures may be necessary to preserve what little water we have. All he saw was more regulations at a time when a lot of people are pressing for less regulation. Tea partiers. A concept that makes absolutely no sense. We need more effective regulation and less ineffective regulation. If you say a statement like that, now you're making some sense. The idea of just less regulation, I was watching O'Reilly tonight. He was talking about snail darters, but he didn't talk about that potentially the environment actually needs these species for us to continue breathing or having clean water. In any event, we need more effective regulation and less ineffective regulation. My friend, that's the statement you should say. So we have a commons, water, that is distributed by the City of Austin Utility, for profit, by the way. We could, but do not have a draconian water rate above the bare minimum, okay? But do not have draconian water rates above the bare minimum, that we use the free market, incentives and disincentives, using really high rates for using one drop above the amount that would be needed to take showers, flush the toilets, and wash the dishes. So in other words, we could have kind of a really minimum amount, whatever it is, 500 gallons a day for a family of 4, and then you do that first gallon and it costs you $50. We don't have that. We could. For some reason or reasons, there are other forces at work keeping that from happening. Now, I know what the other forces at work are, but let's just conjecture. Maybe there's some group or groups or private interests that desire water rates to stay low. Sounds like gas prices, doesn't it? Maybe it's realtors wanting their sellers to water their landscaping prior to sale. Maybe there are landscapers that give money to politicians legally to keep water rates low, exclaiming that there is no emergency. So we have a scarce resource, water, that we as a society have determined we want to be regulated as a free market system with everyone pumping their aquifer dry is not in the best interest of society as to this commons. In Texas, we have a rising population, which some idiots have deemed to be a good thing, and a non-renewable resource that is a commons, water. So we already regulate water. My letter to the editor very simply came up with a way to even the playing field, well beyond the draconian measure of making each gallon above the minimum be very, very expensive. As a side note, there are many very wealthy homeowners that would pay anything to water their invasive species lawns. The cost of the water would have no effect on their water use. So the idea of doing that draconian measure, it would only hurt the middle class, middle and lower class. It wouldn't hurt the upper class. Because they'll just pay it. They don't care. They don't care now. Remember this. The low cost of water is also subject to the inefficiencies that legal lobbying produces. Coal plant operators, nuclear plant operators, and others who would not be able to operate their plants or build their plants without a low cost of water spend billions of dollars lobbying to be allocated from this scarce resource at a subsidized price. T. Boone Pickens has recently been buying up the surface rights of West Texas lands in order to pump water to the thirsty cities of Dallas and Fort Worth. This water will no longer be available for irrigation of the land above it, and the lands will dry out. I'm not complaining about what he is doing. Water for toilets or water for crops, I don't care. As long as the subsidization following legal lobbying is not skewing the process, is not commonizing the costs, and privatizing the profits. So I don't care. I like the free market. It does allocate resources correctly, but not when it's not a free market, which water is not. However, he is lobbying to be granted the right of eminent domain in order to get his pipelines built through people's lands. So he's requiring government help for this private free market play that he's doing. Or it wouldn't work. Let's go back to the response. Let's go back to the response from my friend following my letter to the editor. He tried to say that the slippery slope exists in the case where the state intrudes on our lives. He's correct about that point. The state's a huge behemoth that always wants more power. It's like any other bureaucracy. It builds on itself. Church, corporations, everybody. But I've shown that water is a commons, and we as a society have deemed it to be necessary to be regulated properly, I believe. This particular commons is subject to the same structural regulatory defect of groups, corporations, and other entities, as well as individuals in the state of Texas, e.g., T. Boone Pickett's, being able to donate as much as they want to elected officials, and therefore having influence over the regulations that are written. The slippery slope is really the flowing of our tax dollars and cheap regulations flowing to shareholders of a few corporations and individuals that profit from their legal influence buying. And it's legal in Texas for individuals to give as much as they want. It's not legal nationally. It's up to us to regulate this influence properly, and absent a constitutional amendment, it will not happen, as you've known from all my prior rants. I think that looking at my letter to the editor through the lens of this analysis, you may come to agree that my call to invalidate any deed restriction that requires an individual to water any landscaping will save a ton of money for individuals in their water bills, will save a ton of money in having to build new water treatment plants, or at least will push off to a later time such gigantic capital requirements, which should make the Tea Party happy. So my friend, if you're a Tea Partier, you should be happy for my call. And it will train people to deal with a drought such as this one by planting xeriscaping that does not require water, as they do in Arizona. We've already determined that we desire this commons to be regulated, otherwise it will become decimated. However, this is the classic case of bad regulation due to the structural regulatory defect, which I'll get to. All I'm doing is saying that lawns are wasteful. The structural regulatory defect is that lobbying ability, the legal lobbying. All I'm doing is saying that lawns are wasteful and stupid, especially in fire ant land of Texas. Your kids do not roll around in your lawn down here. They'd be eaten alive, literally. Water districts and boards and cities have shown that they are unable to buck the influence of the various water-using groups, as they've failed to raise water rates to such high levels that people will stop watering their lawns. So legislation and regulation is necessary. This is not a free market item. It's not an inkjet printer, as I've said in my healthcare rants. Or we can just wait for the big drought and then deal with it, because it'll happen. I just thought I would come up with a partial solution now before the water Armageddon. On a related note about not paying the actual cost of something, there was an editorial in the Austin American-Statesman called Problems with Our New Urbanism by editorial board member Julia Robinson, dated July 30th, 2011. I'm going to read a chunk of it solely to get to one sentence that shows the idiocy prevalent in our society and our local newspaper, as though you needed more. I've read quite a few editorials to you over the last year or so. Quotes, "It's a couple of hours before sundown, but already the precious parking spaces on both sides of Rainey Street, that's downtown, have been claimed. Young people seeking a good time in what were once working-class homes that are now trendy bars are making their way up Rainey Street. For years, the neighborhood just west of Interstate 35 and south of Cesar Chavez Street was a somnambulant enclave of modest wood frame homes, but its days as a working-class barrio were numbered when the downtown revitalization boom hit full stride in the 1990s. As the families started leaving, their homes became gathering places for the young and the hip. It's a scenario that is playing out in neighborhoods close to downtown. As the Austin American-Statesman's Juan Castillo reported last week, the city's push for more density has put somebody's good times and somebody else's good night's sleep at odds. Welcome to the new urbanism, Austin style. Castillo related the experiences of residents of close-in neighborhoods who are at the forefront of the city's march toward being more compact. Proponents of the compact concept tout the environmental benefits of density. Shorter commutes will reduce carbon emissions and spare hill country terrain and assault by asphalt. It makes sense in the broad strokes, but as Austinite Jesse Flores learned, there's a price to be paid. Flores, a resident of the Guadalupe neighborhood just east of downtown Entertainment District, had the misfortune of suffering a stroke in 2010, a misfortune compounded by the fact that the South by Southwest Festival was in full swing. Though the University Medical Center Brackenridge emergency room was less than a mile away, an ambulance took 20 minutes to get there because of the snarled traffic. New urbanist theory emphasizes pedestrian-friendly policies and mass transit. Pedestrian friendly means sidewalks, which will be expensive retrofits in neighborhoods like Rainey Street. So pedestrians find themselves sharing the street with vehicles driven by people looking for a place to park. Here's the sentence I care about. Quotes, new urbanism also stresses the need for mass transit, but Austinites love their cars. Close quotes. All right. Austinites love their cars. People won't live in tall buildings. Everyone wants a yard. We've heard all of these statements over and over and over again. When I've talked about dense buildings down in Bonita Bay in Florida, they have 30-story buildings in the center of the Everglades, and they take a tiny, tiny footprint, and a tiny, tiny road goes out to that thing. Instead of taking 100 acres, they use 1 acre. Eagles, gators, birds. They build all those homes, all those animals go away. People tell me people in Texas won't live in buildings. If it's your only option, that's what you'll live in. Now, new urbanism also stresses the need for mass transit, but Austinites love their cars. All right, going back to what the structural regulatory defect is, because I'm going to have to rant on about 10 items here. Austinites love their cars because gas is only $3.60 a gallon. We're going to try and figure out what the real cost of a gallon of gas is. Now, the structural regulatory defect is the ability of Exxon or Chevron or Texaco or BP to send as much money as they want to a campaign under the Citizens United case. There's no term limits for senators and congressmen, so they're always running for office. So they have to take the money, just like the person that doesn't want to take the steroids when they were legal, just like that baseball player. You have to take the money or you won't get reelected. If you don't want to get reelected, that's fine. Maybe you will be that famous citizen politician. Rare. De minimis. Zero. The structural regulatory defect also allows regulators, congressmen, senators, vice presidents to go back to the companies that they regulated when they were in government service, which means wink, wink, nod, nod, they get the regulations they want. They send the drafts of the regulations that they want. Do you remember those secret energy policy meetings that were done in 2002, I think? Dick Cheney? What do you think they talked about? Oil and gas supplies. Tax policy. I can't get a meeting with the vice president because I don't give that kind of money. The structural regulatory defect forces these politicians to take the calls, to read the regulations that are drafted by the companies, and to give them the tax policy and the regulations, and enter the wars that they request to secure our oil supplies. We have an oil depletion allowance. That means they get paid for the fact that the aquifer of oil is draining. How do you think they got that tax policy? How do you think that we have very, very low corporate tax rates? Now, I know I argue with my old friend Swill about tax policy. And I argued here recently in New York, in the New York area, that originally corporations, there were very, very few when the Constitution was written. They did limit liability. Well, the cost of limited liability under our structure is paying taxes. He talks about you raise taxes, you ruin economic development. Probably right. If something costs more, there's going to be less people doing it. Usually we want to go ahead and push those taxes to the point that it does not stifle economic activity. Can't do that now because we don't know what our new paradigm is going to be. But in any event, the structural regulatory defect allows these energy companies to pocket a lot of money, profits. Not only do they pocket those profits, but it allows enough fluctuation that they do not have to, under the regulations that are written, they do not have to pay for the real costs. Oil and gas are not even listed as hazardous materials under federal law. They were exempted. They don't have to clean up the same way that you would have to clean up PCBs due to the disproportionate influence that they have. The real cost of extracting that oil. They don't have to pay the real cost of the pollution that is caused. They complain about environmental regulations and catalytic converters. But there's a study out that by 2020, the U.S. government, or the governments, will be paying 1/2 of all the healthcare costs in the United States. That's not even under Obamacare. That's just the drive that it was going towards, Medicare and Medicaid. So if we, the taxpayers, are paying the costs of the healthcare, we have a right to regulate those things that affect the health. That's Goldie's view, my view. Now let's talk about the real costs of the lives lost. I went through some of those VA horror stories. PTSD, not being claimed, veterans losing benefits. The VA is trying to save money. They keep their jobs by saving money. What about the 300,000 Iraqis killed? How many Libyans have we killed? How many Libyan babies have we killed? How many Yemeni babies have we killed? How many people have we killed? How many Americans have died just to secure the oil? That cost doesn't go into the gallons. It gets commonized. We, the taxpayers, pay for it. Now maybe that's fairer because almost everybody drives a car and uses energy. Maybe that's one of those commonized costs that is almost close to being a user fee. We, the taxpayers. Maybe. But still, I would still like the cost-benefit analysis to be done by the companies that are profiting from it, if they paid the real healthcare costs of what they have. Nuclear energy, for example. State of Texas, because they were lobbied, allowed a nuclear waste dump in Andrews, West Texas. We, the taxpayers, are paying for that. The profits are going to the nuclear companies, or companies that use nuclear energy. So our incentive is to buy stock in those companies under the current system. Do you see the incentives and disincentives and how that's wrong? How it's skewed? How it's messed up? But the lives lost, how do you price them? They are priced because there's some kind of life insurance that they get. I've talked about the pollution and the cost of healthcare. It's not paid for by the people that are profiting from it. In which case they would do a cost-benefit analysis. They would determine what cost to charge for the gasoline. But we have many companies that make a lot of money because the price of gas is at whatever it is, $4.13 up in Connecticut, $3.69 down in Texas. So just think, if gas was $10 a gallon, how many Austinites would love their cars? Do Europeans love their cars as much as Americans? No. Are Europeans more compact? Yes. Do they have smaller land masses? Yes. Do they make it difficult to park? Yes. They pay $10 a gallon. Why do we not? It's not due to taxes. It's the real cost. Make them pay the real cost. When I talked about the hard drive that I bought for $105, I stated that that was not the real cost of that item. The real cost of that item would also include the pollution that was caused by making it, as well as the disposal of the item. It'd probably be closer to $300. So my idea that, again, this is Mr. Anecdotal speaking, that the real cost of the price of a gallon of gas is $10. Would we hear anybody whining about new urbanism? No, we wouldn't. We would be talking about heights. We were talking about we need more heights because we need more units to bring down the cost of these units. That's what you'd hear. You'd hear it from the buyers and you'd hear it from the developers. There would be no argument about new urbanism. The real cost. That's what we need to be paying. Thanks a lot. That's all there is today. I want to thank our sponsors, all of which support this form of conversation, but not necessarily, in fact, definitely not the content. PianoByAngelo.com, Angelo Limbessis, who teaches and plays keyboards all over Austin. ZetaDesign.com for all your decorative painting needs. She can make anything look like anything. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your Austin plumbing problems. www.ticoadventurelodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica, run by a couple of friends of mine. CNC Surf School in Samara at www.cncsurfsamara.webs.com. La Vela Latina, great sunset bar and restaurant in Samara. Ambar Tequila at www.santosspirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Another cool 4-unit green hotel in Samara called The Logan at www.thelogansamara.com. And of course, The Delicate Genius in Houston, who is a platinum sponsor. Thanks for coming out.